The creak of old wood woke me at 3:42 a.m., precisely the time when the grandfather clock in our entryway always needed winding. Except Philip had been dead for 3 years, and I'd stopped winding that clock the day after his funeral. I sat up in my bed, listening to the silence of our Victorian home in Ridgewood. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed fragile, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Outside my window, red and blue lights pulsed against the curtains. Police. Finally. My name is Catherine Wilson. I'm a 52-year-old history professor, a mother of 2 grown children. And until 12 hours ago, I thought I knew everything important about my husband of 25 years. I was wrong. It started that morning when Mike Donovan began demolishing the basement wall that wasn't on any of the original blueprints. I'd hired his company to renovate the house, Philip's ancestral home, so I could finally sell it and move on with my life. 3 years of rattling around this enormous place alone was enough. "This wall's newer than the rest," Mike had commented, tapping it with his knuckles, "probably added in the 70s, judging by the materials." I'd nodded absently, more focused on the kitchen designs I was reviewing. "Do whatever needs doing. I trust your judgment." 2 hours later, I was pouring myself a cup of coffee when I heard rushed footsteps on the basement stairs. Mike appeared in the kitchen doorway, his ruddy complexion gone ash-gray, his calloused hands visibly trembling. "Mrs. Wilson," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be living here. Not for one more minute." I'd nearly dropped my mug. "What? Why? What's down there?" But Mike just shook his head, pulled out his phone, and called the police. "This is Mike Donovan of Donovan Construction. I need officers at 47 Oakwood Drive. We've found something." When he hung up, he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mrs. Wilson, I suggest you wait outside. The officers will want to talk to you," but he swallowed hard. "You shouldn't go down there. Not until they've seen it." Of course, I immediately headed for the basement stairs. But Mike blocked my path with surprising agility for a man in his 60s. "Please," he said, his voice firm despite his pallor. "Trust me on this." So I waited, pacing the wraparound porch, watching as first one police car arrived, then another, then an unmarked sedan. Detective Morales introduced himself with a grim handshake, asked me a few preliminary questions, then disappeared into the house with his partner. That was 7 hours ago. Since then, my quiet street has transformed into a law enforcement carnival. Crime scene tape now cordons off my yard. Neighbors peer from windows and porches. A van marked medical examiner arrived 2 hours ago, followed by people in white coveralls carrying equipment I recognized from too many crime shows. When Detective Morales finally emerged to speak with me again, the weight of the day had etched deep lines around his eyes. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, gesturing to the porch swing. "We need to talk about your husband." "Philip's been dead for 3 years," I said, not moving. "Heart attack." "What could he possibly have to do with whatever's in my basement?" "Please sit." I sat. "When was the last time you went into the basement?" he asked. "I don't know, years. Philip always handled anything down there. Said the foundation was unstable. That the moisture could trigger my asthma." I crossed my arms against the evening chill. "Why? And you never questioned that?" "Why would I? The house is over 120 years old. Victorian homes in New England are notorious for problematic basements." A defensive note crept into my voice. "What exactly did Mike find behind that wall?" Morales sighed, rubbing his temples. "A hidden room, and inside it, evidence related to several disappearances from the 1970s. The world tilted sideways." "What kind of evidence?" "Documentation, photographs, personal effects." He paused, clearly weighing his next words. "And human remains." The porch swing stopped moving. My lungs forgot how to draw breath. That's not possible." I finally managed. Philip's family has owned this house for generations. His grandfather was a judge. His father was a respected businessman. Philip himself was a high school principal. They weren't. They couldn't have been. We don't know exactly what we're dealing with yet, Morales said, his tone gentler now. But we found a journal that appears to have belonged to Judge Wilson, your husband's grandfather. It contains concerning information. I want to see it, I said immediately. Mrs. Wilson, it's evidence in what's now a multiple homicide investigation. It's my house, my husband's family. I deserve to know. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. Wait here. When he returned, he handed me a clear evidence bag containing an old leather-bound journal. Through the plastic, I could make out the elegant script on the first page. The personal records of Judge Arthur Wilson, 1962-1976, page 47, Morales said quietly. I turned to it carefully. My hand suddenly clumsy with dread. The handwriting was smaller here. More hurried. Nov 1971. Another one today. Reynolds threatened to go public about the Harrington verdict. Said he had evidence that would bring down half the county. Jameson handled it as usual. The basement room is becoming crowded. Williams suggests we consider the garden, but the risk of discovery is too great. This cannot continue indefinitely. Yet I see no way to end it without exposing everything. My stomach lurched. I flipped through more pages, catching fragments that turned my blood to ice. The Mackenzie woman was unfortunate but necessary. William says his boy Frederick has begun asking questions. 3 more this year alone. The situation grows untenable. Frederick, Philip's father. I closed the journal, my fingers numb. This can't be real. I'm afraid forensic evidence suggests otherwise, Morales replied. We've already identified 3 sets of remains. Preliminary examination indicates they match the descriptions of individuals mentioned in that journal. People who disappeared between 1968 and 1974. And Philip, did he? I couldn't finish the question. We found letters, Morales said carefully, written by your husband to his father in 1995, shortly before your marriage. In them, he references discovering the family secret and promises to protect it. The world contracted to a pinpoint. 1995, the year before our wedding, the year Philip had inexplicably insisted we live in the family home, despite my preference for something smaller, newer. For 25 years, I'd slept above a makeshift grave, made love to a man who knew what lay beneath our feet, raised children in a house of horrors, and Philip had chosen to protect his family's dark legacy rather than expose the truth. Mrs. Wilson? Morales's voice seemed to come from a great distance. We'll need you to come to the station to make a formal statement. I nodded mechanically. Of course. Do you have somewhere you can stay tonight? Family? Friends? My sister lives in Cambridge, I heard myself say. I can call her. As I rose on unsteady legs, a uniformed officer approached Morales, speaking in a low, urgent voice. I caught fragments. Another room behind the library bookcase. More recent. Morales's expression shifted from grim to alarmed. He turned to me with new intensity. Mrs. Wilson, when exactly did your husband die? 3 years ago, I said automatically. Why? He didn't answer. Just strode toward the house, barking orders to his team. I stood alone on the porch, watching as more equipment was carried inside, as flashbulbs illuminated rooms where I'd graded papers, hosted dinner parties, built a life I thought I understood. The grandfather clock began to chime inside the house. 4 distinct bells. It was now 4:00 a.m. I hadn't wound that clock in 3 years. I pulled my phone from my pocket with shaking hands and called my sister. Sarah, my voice cracked. I need to come stay with you. No, I can't explain over the phone. Yes, it's about the house. I took a shuddering breath. Philip wasn't who I thought he was. None of them were. As I hung up, Detective Morales emerged from the house again. His face told me everything before he spoke. "Catherine," he said, using my first name for the first time. "We need to talk about the room behind the bookcase." I never liked the library. It was Philip's domain, a somber room lined with leather-bound books that had belonged to his grandfather and father before him. Dark wood paneling, heavy velvet curtains, and an ever-present smell of pipe tobacco, though Philip himself never smoked. Now, following Detective Morales through my own home like a stranger, the library took on an entirely new dimension of wrongness. "We found it because one of our technicians noticed a draft," Morales explained as we entered the room. Crime scene technicians moved around us like ghosts. Photographing, measuring, collecting. The bookcase on the east wall conceals a door mechanism. My eyes went to the wall in question, where the built-in shelves now stood partially detached from the wall, revealing a narrow passage beyond. "It's been there all along." My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. "Based on the construction, it was likely built with the original house in 1897, Morales confirmed. "But what we found inside appears much more recent." I steeled myself. "Show me." He hesitated. "Catherine, I want to prepare you. This isn't like the basement. This is personal." A chill ran through me. "Personal? How?" "It appears to be your husband's private study. A place he kept hidden from everyone, including you." The room beyond the bookcase was small, perhaps 8 by 10 feet, with a single high window that would be invisible from outside, cleverly disguised as part of the decorative gable. A desk dominated the space, its surface neat and organized. Filing cabinets lined one wall. The opposite wall held a corkboard covered in newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes connected by red yarn like something from a detective movie. But what stopped my heart was the collection of photographs on the desk. Me, our children, Philip's parents. All of us caught in casual moments, family vacations, graduations, ordinary days. Beside them sat a journal bound in the same leather as Judge Wilson's, but newer, the name Philip Wilson, embossed in gold on its cover. "Is that I couldn't finish?" "Your husband's personal journal," Morales confirmed. "We've only skimmed it, but it appears to chronicle his knowledge of and response to the family's activities." "Was he?" I swallowed hard, forcing out the question I'd been dreading. "Was Philip involved like his grandfather?" "We don't think so. Not in the same way, but he knew. And he protected them by keeping the secret." Morales gestured to the journal. "You should sit down." I sank into the desk chair, running my fingers over the leather cover. 25 years of marriage and I'd never seen this journal before. Had never known this room existed. "Can I read it?" I asked, looking up at him. "Technically, it's evidence," he replied. "But since it's your house and your husband's property," he sighed. "Just don't remove it from this room for now." I opened to the first entry, dated September 3, 1995. "I found it today. The hidden basement room Father always warned me never to look for." I was replacing the water heater when I noticed the discrepancy in the wall dimensions compared to the rest of the house. One pry with a crowbar and decades of family secrets spilled out like a cancer. There are bodies in my family home. 3 that I found along with grandfather's journals detailing their crimes, mostly threats to expose corruption in his courtroom. Father knew all these years. He knew carried the burden of this knowledge. Protected grandfather's dark legacy. What do I do? If I go to the police, our family name is ruined. Father would likely be implicated as an accessory after the fact. I would lose everything. My position at the school, my standing in the community, and Catherine, God, Catherine, we're supposed to be married in 4 months. How could I bring her into this nightmare? But how can I live with myself if I do nothing? I turned the pages with trembling hands, reading Philip's agonized deliberations, his moral wrestling. His eventual terrible decision. Knob 15, 1995. I've decided I will seal the room more permanently. Install a false wall that looks original to the house. No one will look for what they don't know exists. The victims' families have long since accepted their loved ones as missing or runaway. Opening those wounds now serves no purpose but destruction. I will carry this burden as father did. I will protect our family name. Not for grandfather's sake. He deserves no protection. But for father who was only a child when these horrors began. For mother who would be destroyed by association. For my future with Catherine, which would be annihilated if the truth emerged. This is my penance. To know, to remember, to ensure nothing like this ever happens again, and to make certain this house never leaves Wilson hands, lest someone else discover what lies within its walls. I looked up at Morales, my vision blurred with tears. He knew before we were married. He knew all along. Keep reading, Morales said quietly. Later entries. I flipped forward several years to an entry dated shortly after our son James was born. March 20, 2000. James sleeps upstairs in his nursery, innocent and perfect. Catherine has created life where my family once dealt in death. Sometimes when I hold him, I'm overwhelmed by the contrast. This pure new soul in a house with such darkness in its foundations. I'd begun researching the victims, learning who they were beyond grandfather's clinical descriptions of their interference, real people. Elizabeth Mackenzie, a court clerk who noticed discrepancies in case files. Thomas Reynolds, a journalist investigating corruption charges. Maria Sanchez, a housekeeper who witnessed a meeting she shouldn't have. I can't undo what grandfather did. Can't return these people to their families, but I can remember them. Can honor them in some small way by ensuring their stories aren't completely lost. He was documenting them? I asked, looking up at Morales. The victims? It appears so. From what we can tell, your husband was conducting his own investigation into his grandfather's crimes, identifying victims, researching their backgrounds, even attempting to understand the full scope of the corruption that led to their deaths. Why? If he wasn't going to tell anyone, keep going, Morales urged gently. The last few entries. The final dated entry was from 3 weeks before Philip's death, October 8, 2020. I've made my decision. After 25 years of silence, I can no longer bear the weight of this knowledge alone. The victims deserve justice. Even this belated, their families deserve answers. I've prepared everything. Copies of grandfather's journals, my own research, documentation of the corruption ring that operated through his courtroom for nearly 2 decades. Tomorrow, I'll call Lawrence at the DA's office, arrange a confidential meeting. The statute of limitations on most of these crimes has long expired, but murder has no expiration date. Catherine will never forgive me for the deception, for bringing her and our children into a home with such darkness, for the scandal that will engulf our family name. But I can't leave this world with this sin still buried in the walls. For the first time in 25 years, I feel as though I might sleep without nightmares. The next page was blank. The entry after that written in a different hand, my own dated 3 days after Philip's death. Philip, it's Catherine. I don't know why I'm writing in your journal. The funeral was yesterday. The children are devastated. I found this book in your desk drawer and thought I don't know what I thought that I might find some part of you I could still talk to. The doctor said it was your heart. So sudden, no warning. One moment you were heading out the door saying you had an important meeting. The next gone. I miss you so much already. The house feels emptier without you. Though you were always so quiet within it, like you were carrying something heavy I couldn't see. I love you. I'll always love you. I closed the journal, my hands shaking violently now. He was going to confess, I whispered. He was going to expose everything. Yes, Morales said. And then he conveniently died of a heart attack the day before his scheduled meeting with the district attorney. The implication hung in the air between us. You think he was murdered? I said flatly. We think it's a significant coincidence that your husband died just before he was going to reveal a decadecile-long conspiracy involving prominent local figures. Yes, but who would have known? Who could have possibly? I stopped. A horrible thought forming. The bookcase. This room. Someone else knew it existed. That's what we're trying to determine. Morales confirmed. Your husband kept this room secret from you, but was it secret from everyone? My mind raced through possibilities. Philip's father had died 6 years before Philip. His mother had been in a nursing home with advanced Alzheimer's when Philip died, passing herself only months later. Who else would have known about the family's dark history? His brother, I said suddenly. James Wilson. Philip's younger brother. You have a brother-in-law? Morales asked sharply. He's not mentioned in any of the family documents we've reviewed so far. They were estranged, I explained. Had some kind of falling out before Philip and I met. Philip never talked about him, and I only met James twice, at our wedding and at Philip's father's funeral. He lived somewhere out west, I think. Morales was already on his phone, stepping out of the hidden room to issue instructions to his team. I remained at the desk, staring at Philip's journal, trying to reconcile this new reality with the man I thought I knew for 25 years. Philip had been living a double life, devoted husband and father in the light, keeper of terrible secrets in the shadows, had planned to finally unburden himself, only to die before he could, or be killed to prevent that unburdening. I opened the journal again, flipping through to find Philip's earliest descriptions of his brother. There, an entry from 1996, just after our wedding. James knows. I saw it in his eyes at the wedding reception when he cornered me by the bar. I know what you're hiding, brother, he said, his voice slurred with too much champagne. What grandfather did, what father protected, what you're now guardian of. I tried to dismiss it as drunk rambling, but he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. You think you're better than them because you didn't pull the trigger? You're keeping their secrets. That makes you just as guilty. He's right. Of course, that's the hell of it. I am complicit in my silence. But what would exposing it all now accomplish except destroying innocent lives? Catherine's, our future children's. Mothers. James doesn't understand the burden of responsibility. He ran away at 18, changed his name, built a new life far from here. He has the luxury of moral clarity without consequences. I looked up as Morales returned. His expression grim. James Wilson legally changed his name to James Bennett in 1988, he informed me. He's a real estate developer in Arizona now, and according to his credit card records, he was in Ridgewood 3 days before your husband's death. The implication was unmistakable. You think Philip's own brother killed him? I whispered, the horror of it almost incomprehensible. To protect the family secret or to protect himself? Morales suggested. If your husband was preparing to expose everything, who knows what other secrets might have come to light? I stared at the corkboard covered in Philip's meticulous research. 25 years of private investigation, all conducted in this hidden room while life continued normally on the other side of the wall. All those evenings he spent working late or catching up on paperwork in the library. All those times he insisted I not disturb him there. I need to understand, I said, rising from the chair. I need to know everything Philip knew. Morales nodded slowly. That might actually help our investigation. No one knew your husband better than you did. You might see connections we would miss. As dawn broke outside the high window, casting pale light across Philip's secret domain, I made a decision. I would not run from this horror. Would not hide at my sister's house while strangers pieced together the shattered remnants of my marriage. I'll help you, I told Morales. Whatever it takes. If Philip was murdered for trying to do the right thing, I owe it to him to finish what he started. The detective studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Well, set up a command center in your dining room. You can work with our analysts to go through all this material. He gestured around the hidden study. But Catherine, this investigation could expose things about Philip you might not want to know. I thought of the man who had held me every night for 25 years. Who had raised our children with patience and kindness, who had, according to his own words, been preparing to sacrifice everything, including my love, to finally bring justice to the dead. I already know the most important thing, I said quietly. In the end, he chose the truth, no matter the cost. I need to do the same. As Morales led me back through the bookcase passage, I paused for one last look at the hidden room where my husband had wrestled with his demons alone. I'll finish what you started, Philip, I whispered. I promise. 2 days passed in a blur of police activity and shocking revelations. I moved into Sarah's guest room in Cambridge, returning each day to work alongside the investigation team. My home had become a crime scene, my marriage a mystery I was desperately trying to solve. Morales kept me updated on their search for James, now James Bennett. But he seemed to have vanished after his brief visit to Ridgewood. His credit card had been used at a local hotel for 2 nights, then at a gas station near the Massachusetts border. After that, nothing. We'll find him, Morales assured me as we sat at my dining room table, now covered with copies of documents from Philip's hidden study. In the meantime, let's focus on what your husband discovered. Philip's research was meticulous. He'd created detailed profiles of each victim, reconstructing their lives from newspaper archives, public records, and his grandfather's chilling journal entries. Judge Arthur Wilson had operated at the center of a corruption ring that extended through local government, law enforcement, and business circles in the 1960s and 70s. Anyone who threatened to expose them disappeared, their bodies concealed in the basement room built specifically for that purpose. Your husband identified 17 victims in total, Morales explained, spreading out a timeline Philip had created. 3 were hidden in the basement. The others were presumably buried elsewhere. The garden? I said, remembering a passage from Judge Wilson's journal. He mentioned considering the garden. Morales nodded. We've already found 4 sets of remains there, buried beneath what is now your rose garden. The roses Philip had insisted on planting the year after we moved in. The roses he tended so carefully every spring. He was marking their graves, I whispered, the realization striking me like a physical blow, making sure they weren't forgotten. It appears so, Morales agreed. Each rose bush corresponds to a victim in his grandfather's journal. I pushed away from the table, suddenly needing air. I need a minute. Outside on the porch, I gulped the autumn air, trying to reconcile these new revelations with the man I'd loved. Philip planting roses over murder victims. Philip living a double life for decades. Philip carrying the weight of his family's sins alone rather than risking our happiness. Mrs. Wilson. I turned to find a young officer standing tentatively in the doorway. Detective Morales asked me to tell you. They found something in the study, something addressed to you. I followed him back inside to the hidden room behind the bookcase. Morales stood at the desk holding a sealed envelope. It was in a false bottom in the top drawer, he explained, handing it to me. Your name is on it in your husband's handwriting. The envelope was heavy, sealed with wax in an old-fashioned way that was so typically Philip. My name was written in his precise script across the front. Do you want privacy? Morales asked. I shook my head. No. Whatever's in here might be relevant to the investigation. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and withdrew several folded pages. The first was a letter dated just 1 day before Philip died. My dearest Catherine, if you're reading this, 2 things have happened. I am gone and you have discovered the room behind the library wall. I pray you found this letter before learning the rest from others. But I fear that's unlikely. First, I must beg your forgiveness for 25 years of lies. Not lies about my love for you or our children. That has always been completely true. But lies of omission about this house and my family's history within it. By now you know about my grandfather, about the people he killed, about the corruption he protected through murder. You know I discovered this terrible truth before our wedding and chose to conceal it rather than expose you to the scandal and pain that would follow. What you may not yet know is that I have spent these decades trying to make some small amends. I couldn't bring myself to expose the truth while my parents lived, while our children were growing up in the shadow of our name. But I've documented everything. Identified every victim, traced the full corruption network that my grandfather protected. Tomorrow, I will take everything to District Attorney Lawrence Mitchell. The case is old, but murder has no statute of limitations. Some measure of justice may still be possible even after all these years. I know this will destroy the life we've built. Our name will be tarnished, our family subjected to public scrutiny and shame. You may never forgive me for bringing this darkness into your life, for raising our children in a house built on such evil. But I cannot die with this knowledge unshared. Cannot face whatever judgment awaits me beyond this life without having finally done what's right. If something happens to me before I can complete this task, everything you need is in the hidden floor, safe beneath my desk. The combination is our wedding anniversary. 10/15/96. I have loved you since the moment we met, Catherine. That at least has never been a lie. Always, Philip. I lowered the letter, tears streaming down my face. Morales had already knelt beside the desk, locating and opening the floor safe Philip described. From it, he withdrew a thick manila envelope and a small voice recorder. This appears to be a complete copy of all his research, Morales said, leafing through the contents. Names, dates, evidence of the corruption network, everything the DA would need to pursue charges, even decades later. I picked up the voice recorder with shaking hands, and this only one way to find out. I pressed play. Philip's voice filled the small room so familiar it made my heart ache. October 10, 2020. My final recording before tomorrow's meeting with Lawrence Mitchell. I've compiled everything. The documentation of grandfather's crimes, the evidence of the broader corruption, the identities of all 17 victims. It's not enough to undo what was done, but perhaps it can provide some closure to the families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. James called again today. He's more insistent about meeting. Says he has information about father's involvement that I need to hear. I've agreed to see him tonight at the Ridgewood Inn. I don't trust him. He was too angry at the funeral, too bitter about being cut out of father's will. But if he knows something I don't, I need to hear it before going to the authorities. If anything happens to me, Catherine, know that I tried to do the right thing, even if it was 25 years too late. I'm sorry for every moment I allowed you to live in ignorance. For every day I pretended this house was just a house and not a monument to my family's sins. You deserved better. I hope someday you'll understand why the recording cut off abruptly. That was the night before he died, I whispered. He was meeting James. Morales was already on his phone, issuing rapid instructions. I want the security footage from the Ridgewood in October 10, 2020. And I want James Bennett's current location now. I sat heavily in Philip's chair, my mind racing. James knew all along. He knew what Philip was hiding. And he was here in Ridgewood the night before Philip died. We'll find him, Morales assured me, ending his call. This recording gives us probable cause for a much more aggressive search. Philip didn't have a heart attack, did he? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We've requested an exhumation order, Morales confirmed. Based on what we've learned, the medical examiner wants to conduct a new autopsy. I nodded numbly. My husband of 25 years, the father of my children, had likely been murdered by his own brother to prevent him from exposing family secrets. What happens now? I asked. Now? Morales said, gathering Philip's evidence envelope. We do what your husband was trying to do. We bring all of this to the DA and we make sure these victims finally get justice." As we exited the hidden study, I paused at the threshold, looking back at the small room where Philip had carried his burden alone for so many years. "I'll finish what you started," I promised again. "No matter what it costs." I just didn't realize then how high that cost would be. "I'm not sure I can watch this," I confessed to Sarah as we sat in her car, parked at a respectful distance from Philip's grave. Autumn leaves scattered across the cemetery grounds, golden and red against the gray morning. "You don't have to be here at all," my sister reminded me, squeezing my hand. "The police don't need you for this part, but I did need to be here." After 3 years of visiting this grave, laying flowers on the headstone, speaking to a husband I thought I knew, I needed to witness this moment of truth. The exhumation order had come through with surprising speed. Philip's body, what remained of it, would be taken to the state medical examiner's office for a new autopsy. An autopsy that would determine whether my husband had truly died of natural causes or had been murdered for trying to expose his family's crimes. "They're starting," Sarah murmured as cemetery workers began the solemn process of unearthing Philip's casket. I watched through the windshield, emotionally numb. The past week had stripped away every certainty in my life. My marriage had been built on a foundation of secrets. My home concealed murdered bodies. My husband had been living a double life for 25 years. And now the final indignity, his rest disturbed because we couldn't even be certain how he died. Morales approached the car, tapping gently on the window. I lowered it, grateful for his professional compassion. "Mrs. Wilson, we're going to transport the casket now. You don't need to follow to the ME's office. I'll call you as soon as we have preliminary findings." "How long will it take?" My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. "Given the circumstances, Dr. Levine has promised to prioritize the case. We might know something by tomorrow." I nodded, unable to form words as I watched workers load my husband's casket into a waiting van. "Any news on James?" I asked, finding my voice again. "Nothing concrete yet. We've flagged his passport, credit cards, known aliases. He's gone underground, but people can't disappear completely anymore." Morales's expression hardened. "We'll find him." As the van pulled away, taking Philip's remains to be examined for evidence of murder, I felt a strange sense of disconnection. The man I'd married, the gentle high school principal who read poetry aloud on Sunday mornings and taught our children to play chess, seemed increasingly distant, a character in someone else's story. "Take me to the house," I told Sarah abruptly. "I need to go through Philip's things myself." "Are you sure?" "The police have already there looking for evidence of murder." "I'm looking for my husband." I met her concerned gaze. "There's a difference." An hour later, I stood in our bedroom. My bedroom, surrounded by Philip's belongings. His clothes still hung in the closet, his reading glasses still sat on the nightstand. I'd been unable to part with anything after his death, preserving his presence like a museum exhibit. Now I moved methodically through his possessions, searching not for clues about his death, but for insights into his life. The hidden study had shown me the burden he carried. I needed to understand how he'd managed to bear it while building a life with me. In his closet, behind rows of neatly arranged suits, I found a small wooden box I'd never seen before. It wasn't locked, just tucked away out of sight. Inside were mementos of our life together, movie ticket stubs from our first date, the hospital bracelet from when James was born, a pressed flower from our wedding bouquet, and photographs, dozens of them spanning our entire relationship. Philip and me at college graduation. Our wedding day holding our newborn children, family vacations, ordinary moments made extraordinary by being captured in time. These weren't evidence of a double life. They were proof that Philip's love for us had been real, despite the terrible secret he carried. At the bottom of the box lay a small leather journal, different from the one in his hidden study. This one was worn, its pages filled with Philip's familiar handwriting. Not documentation of his grandfather's crimes or his own investigation, but simple reflections on our daily life together. April 12, 2003. Took Emma to the park today. She's fearless on the swings, demanding, "Higher, Daddy. Higher," until Catherine intervened. Sometimes watching our children so innocent and joyful, I can almost forget the weight I carry. In those moments, I'm simply a father, not the keeper of terrible secrets. June 30, 2010. Family vacation to the beach. James and Emma built an elaborate sand castle with moats and towers. Catherine read beneath an umbrella, occasionally looking up to smile at their antics. These are the memories I want to overshadow the darkness. Proof that something good could grow in soil poisoned by my family's past. September 4, 2018. Dropped James at college today. The house feels emptier with both children gone. Catherine suggested we finally sell this place. Downsize to something more manageable. Had to deflect again, hating myself for the disappointment in her eyes. Sometimes I think I should tell her everything. Risk losing her rather than continuing this deception. But the fear of her reaction, of seeing disgust replace love in her eyes, keeps me silent, coward that I am. I closed the journal, tears streaming down my face. Even in his most private thoughts, Philip had loved us deeply. His silence hadn't been about protecting the Wilson name, but about preserving the family he cherished. My phone rang, startling me. Detective Morales. Catherine, we need you to come to the station right away. His tone sent a chill down my spine. You found something? The me conducted a preliminary examination. There were anomalies that couldn't be explained by natural causes or normal decomposition. You're saying he was murdered, not a question. We need you to formally identify someone, Morales continued, avoiding direct confirmation. We found James Bennett. 30 minutes later, I sat in an interview room at the Ridgewood Police Department, a cup of untouched coffee cooling before me. Morales entered, accompanied by a man I initially didn't recognize. He was thinner than I remembered, his once dark hair now gray and cropped short. But the eyes were unmistakably Wilson eyes, the same shape and intensity as Philip's. "Hello, Catherine," James Bennett said, taking the seat across from me. "I'm sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances. Did you kill my husband?" The question escaped before I could moderate it. James' expression didn't change. "No, but I know who did." Morales leaned forward. "Mr. Bennett turned himself in at the state police barracks an hour ago. He's agreed to make a full statement regarding your husband's death and the historical matters at the Wilson house." "I've been running for 3 days," James explained, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "Ever since I heard about the construction crew finding the hidden room, I knew it was finally coming out. Everything Philip and I had spent decades trying to process in our own ways." "You knew about the bodies," I said flatly. "About what your grandfather did," he nodded, a bitter smile, twisting his lips. "Philip wasn't the only one who found that room. I discovered it when I was 17, 2 years before he did. The difference is I wanted to expose everything immediately. Philip wanted to protect the innocent, our parents who hadn't known what grandfather was doing in their own basement. You later, your children. So, you ran away," I said, remembering what Philip had written about his brother. "I couldn't live in that house knowing what was beneath it. Couldn't carry on the family name. So, yes, I left at 18, changed my name, built a new life." His eyes held mine. But I never stopped watching. Never stopped waiting for Philip to finally do the right thing. "And he was about to," I whispered. "The night before he died," James nodded slowly. "He called me. After 20 years of minimal contact, he reached out, said he was finally going to the authorities, asked if I would stand with him when it all came out." His voice broke slightly. "I came back to support him. Too late, as it turned out." "If you didn't kill him, who did?" I demanded, leaning forward. James glanced at Morales, who nodded slightly. "Lawrence Mitchell," James said. "The district attorney. The man Philip was planning to confess everything to. Lawrence Mitchell, I repeated, the name landing like a physical blow. The district attorney? The same Lawrence Mitchell who had spoken at Philip's funeral, praising his community service and dedication to education. The same man who had sent me a handwritten condolence card expressing his deep personal grief at the loss of a dear friend and exemplary citizen. Mitchell was part of it from the beginning. James explained, his voice flat with disgust. He was a young prosecutor when grandfather was running his corruption ring. One of the many officials who benefited from case fixing, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. When grandfather died, Mitchell inherited the network, modernized it. Less violence, more sophisticated methods. Morales slid a folder across the table. Mr. Bennett has provided documentation supporting his allegations. Financial records showing irregular payments to Mitchell dating back decades, meeting notes, names of other officials involved in the continuing corruption. Philip discovered Mitchell's involvement about 5 years ago. James continued, it was the missing piece that finally made everything make sense. Why the corruption hadn't died with grandfather. Why certain cases still mysteriously derailed, why investigations into historical crimes kept hitting dead ends, and Philip was going to expose all this to Mitchell himself. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Why would he confront the very person who had the most to lose? Because my brother was many things, but street smart wasn't one of them, James said with a sad smile. He believed in systems. In institutions. He thought if he presented irrefutable evidence to the highest legal authority in the county, justice would have to prevail. He didn't understand that Mitchell would do anything, including murder, to keep his position. I looked at Morales. How did Mitchell do it? The medical examiner ruled Philip's death a heart attack. Preliminary findings from the new autopsy suggest poisoning, Morales replied grimly. A substance that mimics the symptoms of cardiac arrest, but metabolizes quickly, leaving minimal traces. The ME is conducting more sophisticated tests now. The night before he died, Philip met me at the Ridgewood Inn. James picked up the narrative. He showed me everything he'd compiled, including evidence of Mitchell's central role in the ongoing corruption. I begged him not to meet with Mitchell directly. To take everything to the FBI or state police instead. His expression darkened. Philip insisted Mitchell was the appropriate authority, said he'd known the man for 20 years, served on committees with him, trusted him to do the right thing when confronted with irrefutable evidence. And the next day, I couldn't finish the sentence. The next day, my brother was dead. James confirmed a convenient heart attack right before his scheduled meeting with Mitchell. Why didn't you come forward then? I demanded, anger rising through my grief. If you suspected Mitchell immediately, suspected isn't proof, James interrupted. And I had no official standing, just the errunged brother who'd changed his name and abandoned the family decades ago. Mitchell is powerful, connected. He would have dismissed me as a crackpot or worse. So you ran, I said, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. I retreated to regroup. James corrected. Started my own investigation, compiled evidence independently. I was careful, methodical until your construction crew found the hidden room, and accelerated everything. And now I look to Morales. The detective's expression was carefully neutral. The department has contacted the state police and FBI. Given the allegations against the district attorney, the investigation is being transferred to their jurisdiction. We can't have local authorities investigating their own boss. What does that mean for Philip? I asked. For justice, it means this just became much bigger than your husband's murder or even your family's historical crimes, Morales replied. This is potentially the largest corruption case in the state's history. It will take time to build properly. Time? I repeated incredulously. My husband was murdered 3 years ago. The victims in our basement have been waiting for justice for 50 years, and rushing now could jeopardize everything, James said gently. Catherine, I understand your frustration. I've lived with it my entire adult life. But if we move against Mitchell without an airtight case, evidence will disappear, witnesses will be silenced, and the whole truth will never come to light. I stood abruptly, pacing the small interview room. So, what am I supposed to do? Go back to my sister's guest room and wait? Pretend I don't know that my husband was murdered by a man who's still in office, still wielding power? Actually, Morales said carefully. We need your help. I stopped pacing. What kind of help? Mitchell doesn't know we've made these connections yet, the detective explained. Doesn't know James has come forward. Doesn't know about the new autopsy findings. As far as he's concerned, we're simply investigating historical crimes committed by Judge Wilson decades ago. We need to keep it that way, James added. Need to let him believe he's safe while the federal investigation builds its case. And that's where you come in, Morales continued. Mitchell will be watching the investigation, monitoring its progress through his channels. He'll be particularly interested in your reactions. Your knowledge. Understanding dawned. You want me to be your mole, to feed him misinformation. We want you to help us set a trap, Morales corrected. To give Mitchell enough rope to hang himself. It's dangerous, James acknowledged. Mitchell has already killed once to protect himself. He wouldn't hesitate to do so again. I thought of Philip, poisoned for trying to do the right thing after decades of silence. Thought of the victims buried beneath our home, their families still wondering what had happened to them. Thought of the corruption that had festered in Ridgewood for half a century, tainting the entire justice system. I'll do it, I said, my decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. Whatever it takes, Philip tried to expose the truth and died for it. I owe it to him to finish what he started. Catherine. James began, his face tight with concern. No, I cut him off. This isn't just about Philip anymore. This is about all the victims, past and present. This is about finally cleansing my home and this town of secrets that have poisoned everything for decades. Morales and James exchanged glances. If you're certain, the detective said finally, we'll arrange a meeting with the federal agents tomorrow to discuss the operation. I'm certain, I confirmed. A cold resolve settling over me. Mitchell took everything from me. My husband, my trust, my sense of safety in my own home. It's time he paid for that. As I left the police station that evening, the weight of what I'd agreed to pressed down on me. I was no undercover operative, no trained investigator, just a widow and history professor suddenly thrust into a dangerous game of deception against a powerful, murderous adversary. But I had one advantage Mitchell couldn't anticipate. He believed I was still in the dark, still mourning a husband who died of natural causes, still unaware of the Wilson family secrets and his own role in perpetuating them. He had no idea that the quiet, bookish widow he'd patronized at Philip's funeral was now his most dangerous enemy. I'm coming for you, I whispered into the gathering darkness as Sarah drove us back to Cambridge. For Philip, for all of them. Remember, you're not a trained operative, Special Agent Diaz emphasized. For perhaps the fifth time that morning, we sat in a nondescript hotel room that the FBI had converted into a makeshift command center, finalizing details for what they called the approach. Keep it simple, she continued, her dark eyes intent on mine. Express your confusion about the investigation. Your frustration with being kept in the dark. Mitchell needs to believe you're coming to him as a concerned citizen seeking clarity from the highest legal authority in the county, not as a widow who knows he murdered her husband, I said flatly. Agent Diaz winced slightly. Exactly. As far as Mitchell knows, you're still grieving a husband who died naturally, upset about historical crimes being uncovered in your home, and seeking reassurance. The plan was straightforward. I would request a meeting with DA Lawrence Mitchell, ostensibly to discuss the ongoing investigation at my house. During this meeting, I would appear confused and distressed, mentioning specific details the FBI wanted to monitor Mitchell's reactions to. The entire conversation would be recorded through a device disguised as a bracelet on my wrist. What if he realizes it's a trap? I asked, the question that had kept me awake all night. He won't act against you in his own office, Agent Diaz assured me. And we'll have agents nearby. This is just the first step, getting him on record responding to specific information. James, who had been silently observing from a corner of the room, finally spoke up. Catherine should have protection afterward. Once Mitchell realizes she's asking pointed questions, even innocently, he might see her as a threat. We've arranged for surveillance on Mrs. Wilson's sister's home, Diaz replied. But remember, our goal is for Mitchell to believe Mrs. Wilson is simply a confused widow, not a threat. Not a threat. The phrase echoed in my mind as I was driven to the district attorney's office later that morning. Mitchell had certainly not perceived Philip as a threat either. Just a high school principal with outdated moral principles. That underestimation had been my husband's death sentence. The district attorney's office occupied the top floor of the county courthouse, a grand colonial building that had stood in Ridgewood's town center for over a century. How many corrupt judgments had been rendered within these walls? How many lives ruined by the very system meant to protect them? Mitchell's secretary greeted me with practiced sympathy. Mrs. Wilson, the district attorney can see you now. He's so sorry about this terrible business at your home. Lawrence Mitchell rose from behind his imposing desk as I entered, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his tailored suit projecting authority and trustworthiness. At 62, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to power and deference. Catherine, he said warmly, coming around to take my hands in his, I've been meaning to call you. This must be an incredibly difficult time. I allowed my hands to remain in his briefly, fighting the revulsion that threatened to overwhelm me. This man had killed Philip, had somehow poisoned him, and watched him die, then attended his funeral, and embraced his widow with these same hands. Thank you for seeing me, I managed. Taking the visitor's chair, he indicated. I hardly know where to turn anymore. Completely understandable, Mitchell said, his voice a perfect blend of authority and compassion. The revelations about your home must be deeply disturbing. I feel like I'm drowning in secrets that aren't even mine, I said, the tremor in my voice entirely genuine. Philip never told me anything about the house's history. About his grandfather. Mitchell nodded sympathetically. Arthur Wilson's actions were before my time in Ridgewood, of course, but the records suggest he had significant ethical lapses. I'm so sorry you're bearing the brunt of this historical tragedy. Ethical lapses. Such a sanitized term for serial murder and corruption. The detective in charge, Morales, he's not telling me everything, I continued, following the script we'd prepared. They found Philip's hidden study behind the bookcase. Did you know that? A nearly imperceptible tightening around Mitchell's eyes was the only indication that this information disturbed him. I'd heard something about a concealed room. Yes, old houses often have unusual architectural features. It wasn't just a room, I pressed. It was where Philip kept his research about his grandfather's crimes. Years of it. He documented everything. Did he? Mitchell's voice remained casual, but his fingers drummed once against his desk before he stilled them. That must be helpful to the investigation. There was a journal, I said, watching him carefully. Philip wrote that he was planning to bring everything to you, all his evidence about his grandfather and other matters. He had a meeting scheduled with you the day he died. Now Mitchell's expression changed subtly, a calculation visible behind his sympathetic facade. I don't recall any scheduled meeting with Philip that day, though we did serve together on the education board. Perhaps he mentioned wanting to discuss something. The journal was very specific, I insisted, allowing confusion to color my tone. He said he had compiled evidence of ongoing corruption connected to his grandfather's activities. That he was bringing it all to you on October 11, 2020, the day he died, Mitchell said softly, how tragic that he never had the chance to share his concerns. The strange thing is, I continued, looking down at my hands to hide the hatred I feared would show in my eyes. Philip wrote that he met with his brother James the night before, but James and Philip were estranged. They barely spoke for 20 years. Mitchell's chair creaked as he leaned back slightly. Family reconciliations often happen at unexpected times. Perhaps Philip was setting his affairs in order in some way, making peace with his brother. Maybe, I conceded, then delivered the line the FBI had most wanted included. Morales mentioned they're exhuming Philip's body. Something about inconsistencies in the original autopsy report. Do you know anything about that? The change in Mitchell was subtle but unmistakable. A slight pore beneath his tan, a momentary freeze in his carefully controlled expression. Exhumation is a standard procedure when new evidence comes to light in historical cases. He recovered smoothly. I'm sure it's just procedural thoroughness. What new evidence could possibly relate to Philip's heart attack? I asked, injecting innocent bewilderment into my voice. He wasn't even born when these murders happened. Mitchell stood, signaling the end of our meeting. Catherine, I wish I could offer more clarity. These investigations can seem confusing and unnecessarily intrusive to civilians. Rest assured, my office is monitoring the situation closely. If there's anything improper in how the police are handling this matter, we'll address it. A threat disguised as reassurance. I rose as well, clutching my purse with white-knuckled fingers. Thank you for your time, I said. It helps to know someone with authority is watching over things. As Mitchell walked me to the door, he placed a paternal hand on my shoulder. Catherine, a word of advice from someone who's seen many investigations over the years. Be careful about getting too involved. These matters can become complicated. For your own well-being, perhaps consider stepping back, letting the professionals handle it. Perhaps even take a trip somewhere. Give yourself distance from this situation. His grip tightened almost imperceptibly, a squeeze that could be interpreted as comforting or cautioning, depending on what one knew about Lawrence Mitchell. I'll consider that, I said, meeting his eyes directly. Philip always said you were someone who understood the importance of doing the right thing, no matter how difficult. Something cold flickered in Mitchell's gaze before his political smile reasserted itself. Your husband was an exemplary man. We all miss him deeply. I managed to maintain my composure until I reached the black sedan where Agent Diaz waited. Once inside, I doubled over, breathing in shallow gasps. He did it. I choked out. He killed Philip. I could see it in his eyes when I mentioned the exhumation. Diaz was already reviewing the recording from my bracelet. You did well, Catherine. Very well. We've got enough here to justify intensifying the investigation. What happens now? I asked, my composure returning gradually. Now, she replied, we wait for Mitchell to make a mistake. And based on what I just heard, he's rattled enough that he might make one very soon. I gazed out the window as we drove away from the courthouse. Mitchell's veiled threat echoing in my mind. For your own well-being, perhaps consider stepping back. He'd killed once to protect his secrets. The trap was set, but I was the bait, and Mitchell was far more dangerous than I had imagined. Mitchell made 3 phone calls within 20 minutes of your meeting, Agent Diaz informed me. The next morning, our makeshift command center had expanded to include additional agents, surveillance equipment, and a wall of photographs connecting key figures in what they now called Operation Heritage. To whom? I asked, accepting the coffee James silently offered. My brother-in-law had become an unexpected ally in this investigation. His decades of independent research into his family's crimes proving invaluable to the federal agents. First call to Police Commissioner Reynolds, Mitchell's golf buddy and appointed official. Second to Judge Harris in the County Circuit Court, the one who would handle any warrants related to the investigation. Third to a burner phone we haven't identified yet. Diaz tapped a surveillance photo of Mitchell looking uncharacteristically disheveled as he left his office after our meeting. He spooked good, I said, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. Let him feel a fraction of the fear Philip must have felt. James placed a cautionary hand on my shoulder. This isn't about revenge, Catherine. It's about justice. We need Mitchell making mistakes, not going to ground. The most significant development, Agent Diaz continued, is that Mitchell has expedited his planned vacation. He's now leaving for his cabin in the Adirondacks tomorrow instead of next week. Running away? I asked. More likely regrouping somewhere he feels secure. Somewhere without electronic surveillance, Diaz corrected. The cabin is registered to a shell corporation. Mitchell believes it's untraceable. But it's not, James guessed, studying the agent's expression. Let's just say we've been aware of this property for some time, Diaz replied with a thin smile. We've had Mitchell under investigation for corruption for nearly a year, though we had no idea about his connection to Philip's death until you came forward. This was news to me. You were already investigating him for what? Financial irregularities, primarily unexplained income, suspicious property acquisitions, standard corruption indicators. Diaz pulled up a file on her laptop. Mitchell has lived well beyond his public servant salary for decades. We traced some income to legitimate investments, but much of it remained unexplained until you and James provided the historical context. The corruption network never died with my grandfather, James explained. It evolved. Less violence, more sophisticated financial crimes. Mitchell inherited the infrastructure Arthur Wilson built, modernized it, made it less visible, but potentially more damaging. And Philip discovered the connection, I said. The pieces falling into place. He wasn't just investigating historical crimes. He found evidence linking those past murders to current corruption under Mitchell. Exactly. Agent Diaz confirmed. Your husband had compiled enough evidence to destroy Mitchell's career and possibly send him to prison. The documentation from Philip's hidden study provides the missing links in our existing investigation. So, what's the next step? I asked, struggling to process this new information. My husband's murder wasn't an isolated crime, but part of a corruption scheme spanning half a century. We continue monitoring Mitchell while expediting the new autopsy results on Philip's remains. Once we have confirmation of poison and the specific type, we can move more aggressively. Diaz closed her laptop. In the meantime, I need you to maintain your routine. Mitchell will have people watching you. You need to appear appropriately distressed, but not suspicious. Appropriately distressed, I repeated flatly. Should I practice looking like a widow who just learned she's been living above buried murder victims or one who suspects her husband was murdered by the district attorney? I'm not sure what the proper expression is for either scenario. James suppressed a smile despite the grim circumstances. Just channel your inner academic. Appear distracted, withdrawn, processing information rather than acting on it. That I can manage, I conceded. 2 days passed in excruciating slow motion. I returned to Sarah's house, took walks in her neighborhood, followed discreetly by both FBI agents and, we suspected Mitchell's unknown associates, and waited for developments. The exhumation results were taking longer than expected due to the complexity of testing for specialized poisons in 3-year-old remains. On the third morning, everything accelerated at once. We've got him, Agent Diaz announced, bursting into Sarah's living room, where I'd been attempting to distract myself with a novel. The ME found conclusive evidence of thallium poisoning in Philip's tissue samples. It's a substance that mimics heart attack symptoms, but would have been undetectable in standard toxicology screens 3 years ago. Thallium, James repeated, setting down his coffee. That's extremely difficult to obtain and historically used by intelligence agencies, Diaz finished. Not something an ordinary person would have access to, but a district attorney with connections might, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the confirmation that Philip had indeed been murdered. Exactly. We've secured an arrest warrant for Mitchell based on this evidence combined with the documentation from Philip's study. The problem is he's at his supposedly secret cabin in the Adirondacks. I finished for her. Yes, we have a tactical team preparing to move in, but it's complicated terrain, and we need to approach carefully. Mitchell is politically connected and media savvy. This needs to be by the book. How long? James asked. The team will be in position by nightfall. We'll move at dawn tomorrow. I should have felt relief. After 3 years believing Philip had died of natural causes, after a week of shocking revelations and dangerous deception, justice was finally within reach. Instead, a strange restlessness seized me. I want to be there, I said suddenly. Absolutely not, Diaz replied immediately. This is a federal operation involving armed agents apprehending a potentially dangerous suspect. I don't mean during the arrest, I clarified. But afterward. I want to see his face when he realizes it's over. When he knows that Philip's evidence survived, that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Diaz looked ready to refuse again, but James intervened. She deserves this, he said quietly. We both do. 3 generations of Wilsons have been defined by these crimes and this corruption. We should be present when it finally ends. After a long moment, Diaz nodded reluctantly. You can wait at the command post with me, miles from the actual arrest site, and only after we have Mitchell in custody. Thank you, I said, relief flooding through me. I need to see this through to the end. Later that evening, as I packed an overnight bag for the unexpected trip to the Adirondacks, Sarah watched from the doorway of the guest room, concern evident in her expression. Are you sure about this, Catherine? Confronting the man who killed Philip. It won't bring him back. I know, I replied, folding a sweater with mechanical precision. But for 3 years, I've been living a lie without realizing it. My marriage, my home, my husband's death, none of it was what I thought. I need to see the truth finally acknowledged, no matter how painful. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Just remember, after this is over, you'll need to decide what comes next. Justice doesn't automatically bring closure. Her words stayed with me as I finished packing as James and I were driven to a private airfield as we boarded a small FBI plane bound for upstate New York. What would come next? I had spent 3 years defining myself as Philip's widow, preserving his memory, maintaining his home. Now that home was a crime scene. That marriage revealed to be built on secrets, that memory forever altered by revelations of his double life. Who was Catherine Wilson without Philip, without the narrative I had constructed around our life together? The question lingered as the plane lifted into the darkening sky, carrying me toward a confrontation 3 years and 50 years in the making. The FBI command post was nothing like the high-tech operations centers depicted in movies. Just a utilitarian cabin requisitioned from the local Forest Service, filled with communications equipment, maps, and grim-faced agents speaking in clipped, professional tones. James and I sat in metal folding chairs near the back, out of the way, but able to observe as Agent Diaz coordinated the final preparations for Mitchell's arrest. Dawn broke over the Adirondacks in a spectacular display of pink and gold that seemed inappropriately beautiful for the darkness of our purpose. On any other day, I might have stepped outside to appreciate the wilderness vista. Today, I barely noticed it. Alpha team in position, crackled a voice over the radio. Perimeter secured. No signs of additional occupants. Beta team? Diaz inquired, leaning over the communication station. Approaching from the north ridge. Visual confirmation of target through thermal imaging. Single heat signature in the main living area. Proceed with caution, Diaz ordered. Remember, the suspect is politically connected. Everything by the book. James and I exchanged glances. The clinical language of the operation created a surreal disconnect from the personal reality that my husband's murderer was about to face justice after 3 years of freedom. Command. This is Alpha Leader. The radio crackled again after several tense minutes. We have a situation. Diaz's posture stiffened. Report, entry team breached the cabin. The target was found lifeless, and the authorities are treating the case as a self-inflicted death. Within the hour, the room fell silent. I felt strangely hollow, as if someone had scooped out my insides and left nothing but an empty shell. He knew we were coming, James said quietly. Somehow he knew. Diaz was already issuing new orders. Redirecting teams, requesting forensics, and the medical examiner. She paused briefly to address us. "I'm sorry," she said, her professional demeanor softening momentarily. "This isn't the resolution we wanted." "Did he leave anything?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "A note, an explanation. The team is searching now. If there's anything, we'll find it." 3 hours later, we had our answer. Mitchell had left behind not just a note, but a full confession. Pages of detailed admissions regarding both Philip's murder and the decades-long corruption scheme. Along with it, a USB drive containing financial records, offshore account details, and a list of co-conspirators throughout local government. He was thorough, Agent Diaz explained as we sat in what had become a makeshift conference room. Almost as if he wanted to ensure the full story came out after he was gone. Or he wanted to control the narrative one last time, James suggested. Define the story on his terms. I stared at the copies of Mitchell's confession that Diaz had provided us. His elegant handwriting filled page after page with the cold details of a corruption network spanning generations, culminating in his matter-of-fact admission of murdering my husband. Philip Wilson approached me on October 10, 2020, claiming to have evidence linking current county operations to his grandfather's historical crimes. He requested a formal meeting the following day to present his findings. After reviewing surveillance of Wilson's activities and confirming he had indeed compiled substantial documentation, I determined his exposure posed an existential threat to the network I had maintained for decades. The decision to eliminate Wilson was not made lightly, but was deemed necessary for operational security. As Wilson was known to have a family history of cardiac issues, thallium was selected as the optimal method. The substance was administered during an impromptu meeting at his office under the guise of discussing an educational initiative. Death occurred approximately 6 hours later, presenting as a cardiac event as intended. So clinical, so detached, as if Philip had been merely an inconvenient obstacle rather than a human being, a husband, a father, a man who had finally found the courage to do the right thing after decades of silence. "He poisoned Philip at the school," I said. The reality of it hitting me anew. While discussing a children's educational program, James placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Mitchell was a sociopath, Catherine. He maintained a facade of civic leadership while orchestrating crimes for decades." "Why confess now?" I asked Diaz. "Why not just run?" Based on what we've pieced together, Mitchell realized the net was closing. Your meeting with him, questions about the exhumation, his own sources within local law enforcement who would have informed him about the federal investigation. Diaz gestured to the confession. This way, he maintained control until the end. Decided what information was released, implicated others on his own terms, and avoided prosecution or imprisonment. A coward's way out, James muttered, perhaps. But Mitchell's final act had provided something Philip's hidden research alone might not have. Absolute confirmation of the corruption network's existence and operations. Names and dates and financial details that would lead to dozens of additional arrests in the coming weeks. What happens now? I asked the question that had been haunting me for days, suddenly unavoidable. For the investigation, we move forward, Diaz explained. Mitchell's confession and records give us everything we need to dismantle the entire network. For you, she hesitated, her professional demeanor softening. That's entirely your decision. You've fulfilled your role in this operation. You're free to return home or not. To stay involved in the subsequent prosecutions or not home. The word no longer carried clear meaning. The Victorian house in Ridgewood would never be home again. Not with its foundation of secrets and death. But where else would I go? Who would I be outside the identity I had constructed around that house, that marriage, that life? "I need to see it," I said suddenly, the certainty crystallizing within me. Mitchell's cabin, where he died, where he wrote this confession. Diaz looked skeptical. It's still an active crime scene. Please, I interrupted. I've spent 3 years visiting Philip's grave, talking to a husband I thought had died of natural causes. I need to see where the man who took him from me spent his final moments. Need to make it real. After a brief consultation with the site supervisor, Diaz agreed. An hour later, James and I stood in the doorway of Mitchell's luxurious cabin. Really a high-end retreat with panoramic mountain views, exposed timber beams, and expensive furnishings. The yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the area where Mitchell had ended his life. An elegant leather chair positioned so that there was a spectacular view through the floor-to-ceiling windows. On the table next to it, evidence markers indicated where he had carefully organized his confession, the flash drive, and finally the evidence. He surrounded himself with beauty while orchestrating corruption and murder, James observed quietly. The ultimate compartmentalization. I moved slowly through the space, taking in the carefully selected artwork, the fine furniture, the well-stocked bar of expensive liquors. Everything spoke of privilege and power of a man who believed himself entitled to more than his legitimate share of life's rewards. On a side table, partially obscured by a case file, I noticed a framed photograph that stopped me cold. Philip and Mitchell standing together at some community function, smiling for the camera. Mitchell's arm was slung casually around my husband's shoulders in a gesture of camaraderie. He displayed this, I said, my voice strangled. A photo with the man he murdered. Kept it out where he would see it every day. James examined the picture. Trophy, he said grimly, reminding himself of his power, his victory. I set the photograph down, suddenly exhausted beyond words. The adrenaline that had carried me through the past week through revelations about Philip's secret research, the hidden rooms, the exhumation, the dangerous meeting with Mitchell, was finally depleting, leaving me hollow. I want to go home, I said, then corrected myself. No, not home. Not to Ridgewood, just away from here. As we left Mitchell's cabin, I paused on the deck overlooking the wilderness vista. The sun was setting now, painting the mountains in deepening shades of purple and gold. Beauty existing alongside darkness, just as Philip's love for me had existed alongside his burden of terrible knowledge. It's over, James said softly, standing beside me. Not the way we expected. But it's over. Not quite, I thought. Justice for Philip had been served through Mitchell's confession, if not through the public trial I had imagined. But the full truth about the Wilson family's dark legacy was only beginning to emerge. The victims buried in my garden and basement still needed names, identities, proper burials. Their family still needed closure after half a century of uncertainty. And I still needed to decide who Catherine Wilson would be now with the foundations of her former life irrevocably altered. Not over, I replied. Just changing. Everything is changing now. 6 weeks after Mitchell's suicide, I stood in the garden of the Wilson house, my house, watching as forensic anthropologists carefully excavated the area beneath what had once been Philip's prized roses. Each bush, I now understood, had been both memorial and marker, his private tribute to victims whose names he had painstakingly uncovered through decades of research. Dr. Levine says they've identified remains of 7 individuals so far. Detective Morales reported joining me at the garden's edge. Though the case had officially transferred to federal jurisdiction, he had remained involved as local liaison. With DNA testing and Philip's documentation, they've already made positive identifications for 5 of them. Their families, I asked, watching as workers carefully transferred bone fragments to evidence containers, being notified this week. After 50 years of wondering what happened to their loved ones, they'll finally have answers. Morales hesitated. It won't be easy news to receive, but in my experience, certainty, even painful certainty, is better than eternal questioning. I nodded, understanding this truth more deeply than ever before. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of revelations, each more stunning than the last. Mitchell's confession had implicated 12 current officials throughout county government. Judges, police captains, zoning commissioners, all maintaining the corruption network he had inherited from Judge Arthur Wilson. Federal indictments were still being processed. The full extent of the conspiracy still being mapped. The Wilson name had become synonymous with corruption in regional headlines. My children, though adults with established lives and different last names, had been besieged by media attention. James had retreated to Arizona after providing his testimony, his decadecil-long estrangement from the family now publicly vindicated. And I had been left to decide what remained of my life amid the wreckage of these revelations. The house has been cleared for re-entry, Morales informed me. Once they finish in the garden, the property will be fully released back to you. Thank you, I replied automatically, though I had no intention of ever living there again. The Victorian mansion that had once been merely oppressive now felt poisoned beyond redemption. I had been staying in a hotel since returning from the Adirondacks, unable to face Sarah's gentle concern any longer, needing space to process everything alone. Each night brought new nightmares. Philip dying alone, calling my name as the poison took hold. Judge Wilson leading victims to their deaths in our basement. Mitchell standing over Philip's body. That photo of them together clutched in his hand. Catherine Morales's voice pulled me back to the present. The FBI agent in charge asked me to give you this. They found it in a secondary hidden compartment in Philip's study. It's addressed to you, but they needed to examine it as evidence first. He handed me a sealed envelope, my name written in Philip's familiar handwriting. Unlike the letter I'd found in his hidden study, this one bore no date, just for Catherine if something happens. Written across the front. I'll give you privacy, Morales said, moving back toward the excavation site. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope, unfolding several pages covered in Philip's precise script. My dearest Catherine, if you're reading this, then I have failed in my attempt to expose the truth, and something has happened to me. I pray that failure doesn't cost you or our children anything beyond my life. I've written so many versions of this letter over the years. First, as a young husband terrified of the secrets I had discovered. Later, as a father determined to protect our children from a legacy they didn't choose. Finally, as a man who could no longer live with his own complicity through silence. What I need you to understand most is that every moment of our life together was real. My love for you, for our children, was never a deception. You were the light that made it possible for me to bear the darkness of what I knew. In a life built on necessary secrets, you and our family were the one pure truth I clung to. I made the decision to conceal my grandfather's crimes when I first discovered them before our wedding. It was wrong morally, legally, in every way that matters. I told myself I was protecting innocent people. My parents, you later our children. But in protecting you from scandal, I denied you the right to make your own informed choice about joining this family, about living in this house. For that, I am profoundly sorry. What began as protection for others became a prison for me. Each year that passed made revelation more impossible, the potential consequences more devastating. I documented everything, researched every victim, traced every connection, perhaps as penance, perhaps preparing for a day of reckoning I couldn't quite bring myself to initiate. When I discovered Mitchell's involvement 5 years ago, that my grandfather's corruption network hadn't died, but merely evolved under new leadership. Something finally broke inside me. I could no longer justify my silence. The evil hadn't ended. It had simply changed form. My silence was enabling ongoing corruption that affected thousands of lives through tainted justice, rigged contracts, selective enforcement. I don't know what will happen once I take everything to the authorities. I hope for justice, though I harbor no illusions about my own culpability. I kept these secrets for 25 years. Whatever legal consequences come, I accept them as the price of finally doing what's right. If something happens to me before I can complete this task, if Mitchell or others connected to this conspiracy somehow silence me, know that I have prepared for that possibility. Copies of my complete research are hidden in 3 separate locations with my brother James. Despite our estrangement, he will help if approached about this matter in a safe deposit box at First National under the name William Hayes. Key in the false bottom of my dresser drawer. Password is the name of the lake where we spent our honeymoon. And with Lawrence Mitchell himself, that last hiding place may seem strange, but it is perhaps the most brilliant. Mitchell keeps a trophy wall of photographs in his private study at home, evidence of his connections to powerful people. I placed a microfilm containing key documentation behind the frame of our photo together at last year's education fundraiser. He displays that photo prominently, never suspecting it contains the evidence that could destroy him. If I disappear, that microfilm will be automatically mailed to the FBI through arrangements I've made. Catherine, whatever you discover about me after I'm gone, please know this. I tried to be a good man despite my grievous moral failure in protecting these secrets. I tried to be the husband and father you and our children deserved. And in the end, I tried to finally do the right thing, whatever the cost. The house is yours to do with as you see fit. Sell it, demolish it, transform it, whatever brings you peace. The victims buried here deserve recognition, and the living deserve freedom from this cursed legacy. I have loved you completely from the moment we met. That truth outshines all the darkness. Forever yours, Philip. I lowered the letter, tears streaming down my face. Even in planning for his possible death, Philip had been meticulously thorough, ensuring the truth would emerge no matter what happened to him. The microfilm behind the photograph in Mitchell's home explained why the district attorney had chosen suicide rather than attempting to flee. He had discovered Philip's final fail-safe too late, realized the evidence would emerge regardless. Professor Wilson, a young forensic anthropologist, approached hesitantly. We've completed documentation of the Rose Garden sites. Dr. Levine wondered if you'd like to see something before we transfer the remains. I followed her to a white tent set up over one of the excavation areas. Inside, Dr. Levine, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes and the steady hands of a surgeon, was carefully examining bone fragments arranged on a table. Catherine, she greeted me. I wanted to show you this. We found it buried with the female victim identified as Elizabeth Mackenzie. She held up a small object, a tarnished locket on a delicate silver chain. It's engraved, Dr. Levine explained, handing me a magnifying glass. Through the glass, I could make out tiny letters. To Lizzie, all my love, Thomas. Elizabeth Mackenzie was engaged to Thomas Reynolds. I said softly, recognizing the names from Philip's research. They both witnessed a meeting between Judge Wilson and local officials. Both disappeared within weeks of each other in 1973. They're buried side by side, Dr. Levine confirmed. Under adjacent rose bushes. Your husband knew who they were. Made sure they remained together. A fresh wave of grief and understanding washed over me. Philip had spent decades honoring these victims in the only way he felt he could, while wrestling with when and how to finally expose the truth. As I stepped back into the autumn sunlight, the letter still clutched in my hand, I realized I had reached a turning point. The past could not be changed. Not Judge Wilson's crimes, not Philip's complicity through silence, not Mitchell's corruption or murder. But the future remained unwritten. What would Catherine Wilson do with that future? The answer, I realized, had been forming within me for weeks. I just hadn't been ready to acknowledge it until now. 1 year later, I stood on the newly landscaped grounds of what had once been the Wilson family home. The Victorian mansion was gone, demolished 6 months earlier after I donated the property to Ridgewood Township with specific conditions for its use. In its place stood a simple stone memorial garden with 17 granite markers arranged in a circle around a central sculpture, a balanced scale tipping slightly toward justice. It's beautiful, Emma said, taking my hand. My daughter had flown in from Seattle for today's dedication ceremony. Dad would have approved. James nodded beside her. Philip always wanted the truth acknowledged. This makes it impossible to forget. The Wilson House Memorial Garden had been my response to the question that had haunted me after Mitchell's suicide. What remains when the foundations of your life are revealed to be built on deception? The answer, I'd realized, wasn't to run from the past, but to transform it into something meaningful. Each marker bore the name of a victim identified through Philip's research and the subsequent investigation. Elizabeth Mackenzie, Thomas Reynolds, Maria Sanchez, 14 others whose disappearances had been mysteries for decades. Below each name was a short biography, who they had been in life, not just how they had died. Teacher, journalist, court clerk, activist, parent, child, friend, lover. People, not just victims. The central plaque explained the site's history in unflinching terms. This memorial stands on the former grounds of the Wilson family home, where 17 individuals were murdered between 1968 and 1974 as part of a corruption scheme orchestrated by Judge Arthur Wilson. Their bodies were concealed on this property for nearly 50 years before being discovered in 2023. This garden honors their memory and serves as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, remains essential to our community's healing. A smaller dedication at the bottom read, established through the Philip Wilson Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. The foundation had been my other response to the shattering of my former life. Using the proceeds from selling the remaining Wilson properties and the settlement from the county's insurance policies following the corruption scandal, I had established an organization dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and investigating cold cases involving corruption. In 9 months, we had already helped expose 2 similar schemes in neighboring counties and provided financial assistance to 3 families whose breadwinners had lost jobs after reporting workplace malfeasance. They're starting to arrive, James noted, gesturing toward the street where cars were beginning to park. Today's dedication would bring together the victims' families, local officials, the non-indicted ones, and community members for a formal unveiling of the memorial. Are you ready for this? James asked, studying my face. Over the past year, he had become not just an ally, but a friend, the estranged brother-in-law. Transforming into family in a way I had never anticipated. As ready as I'll ever be, I replied, smoothing my dress. Public speaking had never been my strength. But as the foundation's director and the former lady of the Wilson house, my remarks were expected. As people gathered on the rows of chairs set up facing the memorial, I recognized faces from photographs Philip had collected. Elizabeth Mackenzie's younger sister, now in her 70s, Thomas Reynolds's nephew, who had been named after his missing uncle. Maria Sanchez's daughter, who had been just 4 when her mother disappeared. For them, this day represented the end of half a century of uncertainty and unanswered questions. Detective Morales, now Captain Morales, following a promotion in the reorganized police department, nodded to me from the side of the gathering. Agent Diaz stood beside him, one of several federal representatives attending to acknowledge the successful prosecution of what had become known as the Wilson-Mitchell Corruption Network. 38 indictments across 3 counties, 14 guilty pleasured, the rest moving through the justice system. When the time came for my remarks, I approached the podium with Philip's final letter in my pocket, not to read from, but as a talisman connecting me to the man who had finally chosen truth over self-preservation. Thank you all for being here today, I began, looking out at the assembled faces. This memorial represents many things. Acknowledgement of terrible crimes, recognition of lives cut short, a community's commitment to remembering what happened here. But perhaps most importantly, it represents the power of truth to eventually overcome even the most carefully constructed deceptions. I spoke about the victims, about the corruption that had claimed their lives, about the decades of silence that had followed. I acknowledged Philip's complicated role, his years of protective silence followed by his ultimate decision to expose everything. A choice that had cost him his life. My husband lived with an impossible moral burden, I told the audience. He discovered his grandfather's crimes and made the wrong choice initially, choosing family loyalty over truth. That choice haunted him for 25 years until he finally found the courage to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. I don't stand here to excuse his silence, I continued. The victims and their families deserve justice decades sooner. But I do stand here to honor his final act, the decision to expose everything, knowing it would destroy his reputation, his family name, possibly even his freedom. That choice ultimately cost him his life, but it also finally brought the truth to light. As I concluded my remarks, I looked directly at the families of the victims seated in the front row. Nothing can return your loved ones or restore the years you spent wondering what happened to them. But I hope this memorial provides some measure of peace, some confirmation that they are remembered, that their lives mattered, that the truth of what happened to them will never again be buried. After the ceremony, I spoke privately with many of the victims' families. Some were angry at Judge Wilson, at Philip, at the entire Wilson family for decades of complicity. Others expressed gratitude for the closure the memorial represented. All of them had questions that I answered as honestly as I could, sharing details from Philip's research about their loved one's final days. As the crowd gradually dispersed, I found myself alone at the central sculpture, tracing the tilted scales with my fingertips. James approached quietly, standing beside me in companionable silence. "What's next for you?" he finally asked. "The memorial is established. The foundation is running. Most of the trials are underway. Have you thought about what comes after?" I had actually. After a year of living in temporary housing, of focusing entirely on establishing the memorial and foundation, I had finally begun to consider my own future. "I've accepted a visiting professorship at Princeton for the spring semester," I told him, teaching a seminar on historical justice and reconciliation. "That's perfect," James said, genuine approval in his voice. "Using everything you've learned these past 18 months. And after that," I hesitated. "I've been corresponding with Dr. Garcia at the International Center for Transitional Justice. They've offered me a position consulting on community healing after systemic corruption is exposed. It would mean traveling, spending time in countries, dealing with similar revelations." "You're leaving Ridgewood," James observed. "Not a question." "There's nothing for me here anymore," I acknowledged. "The house is gone. Philip is gone. The children have their own lives, and everywhere I go, I'm still Catherine Wilson from the corruption scandal." "You could change your name," he suggested. I did. "It helps." I shook my head. "I've thought about that, but I think keeping the Wilson name while doing this work is important. Acknowledging the legacy while transforming it into something positive." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the 17 granite markers, I took one last look at what had once been my home, my prison, my life's foundation. The Victorian mansion with its hidden rooms and buried secrets was gone, replaced by open space, honest remembrance, and the possibility of healing. "Goodbye, Philip," I whispered too softly for James to hear. I kept my promise. The truth is no longer buried. I turned away from the memorial toward the waiting car that would take me back to my temporary apartment. Tomorrow would bring foundation meetings, correspondence with prosecutors, preparations for my upcoming teaching position. The day after, something else. The day after that, something new again. For the first time since discovering the bricklayer fear in my basement doorway 18 months ago, I felt something like peace. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had finally been acknowledged. Transformed from secret burden to open truth. As I reached the sidewalk, I glanced back one last time at the memorial garden glowing in the golden evening light. Some might see only tragedy there. Lives lost, justice delayed, corruption triumphant for decades. But I chose to see something else. Truth finally unearthed, victims finally named, silence finally broken. The scales, though slowly, had ultimately tipped toward justice.